Everyone in the courtroom heard the laughter. It wasn't just the audience, it was her ex-husband, his shark of a lawyer, and even the bailiff snickering at the financial affidavit in her trembling hands. They mocked her worn-out shoes. They ridiculed her $28,000 a year salary. They called her unfit simply because she wasn't rich. They thought they were witnessing the final destruction of a struggling woman. But they didn't know that inside the battered leather briefcase on the defense table sat a document that would silence the entire room, freeze the judge in his tracks, and turn the hunter into the hunted. This is the story of how Sarah Mitchell let them think they had won only to reveal a secret worth $4 billion. The fluorescent lights inside courtroom 304 of the Cook County Circuit Court hummed with a headache-inducing frequency. But for Sarah Mitchell, the sound was drowned out by the droning voice of Preston Holloway. Holloway was a man who cost $600 an hour, and he made sure everyone in the room knew it. He wore his bespoke Italian suit like a suit of armor, pacing the floor with the predatory grace of a tiger circling a wounded gazelle. "Your Honor," Holloway boomed, turning his back on Sarah to address Judge Lawrence Kincaid. "We are not here to question Ms. Mitchell's character. We are here to deal with mathematics, and the math is quite frankly depressing." Sarah sat perfectly still at the defendant's table. She kept her hands clasped in her lap to hide the fact that her fingernails were bitten down to the quick. She wore a simple navy blazer she'd found at a consignment shop 3 years ago. It was clean, pressed, and respectable, but next to the glittering cufflinks of her ex-husband Blake Anderson, it looked like a costume. Blake sat behind Holloway, leaning back in his chair, with a smirk that didn't quite touch his eyes. He checked his Rolex, a Submariner that cost more than Sarah's car, and sighed theatrically. He was the VP of sales for a mid-sized tech logistics firm, Nexus Global. To the outside world, he was a success story. To Sarah, he was the man who had spent 6 years making her feel small so he could feel big. "Proceed, Mr. Holloway," Judge Kincaid said, peering over his spectacles. The judge was a tired man who had seen too many divorces and had little patience for poverty. "Thank you, Your Honor," Holloway continued, picking up a piece of paper as if it were a soiled tissue. "We are looking at Ms. Mitchell's financial affidavit. Her reported monthly income as an assistant art instructor at a community center is barely $2,000 after taxes. Her rent for a 2-bedroom apartment in the suburbs takes up 60% of that." Holloway turned to the gallery, playing to the crowd. 60%. That leaves roughly $800 for food, utilities, insurance, and the child. He let the silence hang. "My client, Mr. Anderson, earns upward of $300,000 annually, not including bonuses and stock options from Nexus Global. He resides in a gated community. He has a dedicated education trust already established. He can provide stability. Ms. Mitchell can barely provide lunch." Blake leaned forward, whispering loudly enough for the microphone to catch it. "I just want what's best for Leo. I don't want him growing up in a place where they have to water down the milk." A ripple of laughter moved through the courtroom. It was quiet, cruel laughter. Sarah felt the heat rise up her neck. It wasn't true. She never watered down the milk. Leo, their 5-year-old son, was happy. He was loved. They made fortresses out of cardboard boxes and painted masterpieces with finger paints. But in this room, love didn't have a currency symbol attached to it, so it didn't count. "Ms. Mitchell," the judge spoke, his voice dry. "Do you have legal representation present? The court notes state you dismissed your public defender." Sarah stood up. Her legs felt heavy, like they were filled with concrete. "Yes, Your Honor. My attorney is running a few minutes late. He had trouble finding parking." Blake snorted. "Probably couldn't afford the garage fees." Holloway chuckled, shaking his head. "Your Honor, with all due respect, this is a stalling tactic. Ms. Mitchell has clearly realized the hopelessness of her financial standing. We are asking for full custody to be awarded to Mr. Anderson immediately, with supervised visitation for the mother, pending a review of her living conditions." "Supervised?" Sarah blurted out, her voice cracking. "I'm his mother. I've raised him every single day while he was on business trips." "And you did a lovely job," Holloway said, his voice dripping with condescension. "But we are talking about his future now. We are talking about private schools. Equestrian lessons. A life Ms. Mitchell, not a survival strategy." "I object to the characterization that my client is merely surviving," a voice came from the back of the room. The heavy oak doors swung open. The room turned. Entering the court wasn't a shark in a shiny suit. It was an elderly man, perhaps in his late 70s. He wore a tweed suit that looked like it smelled of pipe tobacco and old libraries. He carried a battered leather briefcase that had seen better decades, let alone days. He walked with a cane, but his movement was steady rhythmic. Click. Step. Click. Step. Blake whispered to Holloway. "Is that him? He looks like he wandered out of a nursing home." Holloway smirked. "Let him talk. This will be over in 10 minutes. The old man reached the defense table and nodded to Sarah. "Apologies for the delay, Sarah. The security checkpoint had an issue with my hip replacement." Sarah exhaled a breath she felt she'd been holding for months. "It's okay, Arthur." Arthur P. Jenkins was not a high-powered divorce attorney. He was a contract lawyer who mostly handled estate planning for retirees in Sarah's neighborhood. Blake and Holloway had looked him up weeks ago and laughed. He had no website, no LinkedIn, just a phone number in the yellow pages. "State your name for the record." Judge Kincaid sighed, looking at the clock. "Arthur P. Jenkins, representing Miss Sarah Mitchell." "Mr. Jenkins," the judge said, "we are in the middle of a motion regarding the financial instability of your client. Mr. Holloway has made a compelling argument that Ms. Mitchell is financially incapable of matching the lifestyle the father can provide. Do you have a response regarding her income?" Arthur set his briefcase down on the table. He didn't open it yet. He just patted the leather lid affectionately. "I do, Your Honor." Arthur said, his voice surprisingly deep and resonant like a cello. "But first, I'd like to cross-examine Mr. Anderson regarding his financial affidavit. If we are measuring worth by numbers, we should ensure all the numbers are precise." Holloway waved a hand dismissively. "My client's finances are audited and transparent, but if the old man wants to waste the court's time, let him." Blake stood up, buttoning his jacket, and walked to the witness stand. He winked at Sarah as he passed. It was a wink that said, "Game over." Sarah looked down at her hands. She remembered the day she found the papers in her grandmother's attic. She remembered the phone call to Arthur. She remembered the promise she made to herself. Wait until they show who they really are. They had shown it. Now it was time for the turn. Blake Anderson sat in the witness box, the picture of modern corporate arrogance. He adjusted the microphone, looking at the judge with a "can you believe this" expression. Arthur Jenkins shuffled his papers. He didn't look aggressive. He looked confused, like he was looking for a missing crossword puzzle clue. "Mr. Anderson," Arthur began, peering over his reading glasses. You stated in your deposition that Ms. Mitchell is, and I quote, a financial burden and incapable of understanding complex asset management. Is that correct? It is, Blake said smoothly. Sarah is a great artist. But money. She thinks a savings account is high finance. I tried to explain my stock options to her once and she just stared at me. I see, Arthur said. And because of this lack of sophistication, you handled all the finances during the marriage? Naturally. Someone had to. And you are requesting that Ms. Mitchell pay your legal fees, citing her frivolous defense against your custody motion. She's wasting everyone's time, Blake said, leaning into the mic. I'm trying to save my son from a life of mediocrity. If she has to go into debt to learn that lesson, so be it. Holloway nodded approvingly from his table. Arthur stopped shuffling papers. He paused. The confused old man demeanor evaporated instantly. He straightened his spine. When he looked up, his eyes were sharp, intelligent, and dangerous. Mr. Anderson, Arthur said, his voice dropping an octave. Are you familiar with the Global Maritime Logistics Consolidated Merger of 2024? Blake blinked. The question was completely out of left field. Yes, everyone in tech logistics knows it. It was a massive shipping deal. What does that have to do with Sarah's part-time job? And are you aware, Arthur continued, ignoring the jab, that the merger was delayed for 3 days because a majority shareholder had not yet signed off on the transfer of voting rights? Holloway stood up. Objection relevance, Your Honor. Mr. Jenkins is discussing global shipping news. We are here for a custody hearing. I'm establishing the financial landscape, Your Honor, Arthur said calmly. It goes to the heart of Mr. Anderson's claim about who understands finance. Judge Kincaid rubbed his temples. I'll allow it for 2 more minutes, Mr. Jenkins. Get to the point. Arthur turned back to Blake. Mr. Anderson, you work for Nexus Global. Your company was a junior partner in that merger. You received a bonus of $15,000 for your team's role in the integration. Correct? Yes, Blake said, puffing his chest out. I led that integration. 15,000, Arthur mused. A tidy sum. And you used that bonus to put a down payment on your new Porsche, which you listed as a primary asset to prove your stability to this court. It shows I have reliable, disposable income. Right, Arthur said. He walked back to the defense table and placed his hand on the latches of the battered briefcase. Click, click. The sound echoed in the silent room. Mr. Anderson, you mocked Ms. Mitchell for her salary. You mocked her for her lack of sophistication. You claimed she brings nothing to the table. Arthur lifted the lid of the briefcase. He pulled out a single document. It wasn't a thin sheet of paper. It was bound in heavy blue cardstock, stamped with a wax seal that looked older than the courthouse itself. Tell me, Mr. Anderson, Arthur said, walking the document toward the witness stand. In your extensive research into global maritime logistics, did you ever encounter the name the Van der Hoeven Trust? Blake frowned. The color drained slightly from his face. The Van der Hoeven Trust. That's the holding company, the quiet money behind the merger. They own half the shipping lanes in the North Atlantic. Correct, Arthur said. He stopped 3 feet from Blake. And did you know that the Van der Hoeven Trust has a sole beneficiary, a single living heir who holds the voting rights for 51% of the conglomerate? I don't follow. Mr. Holloway, Arthur said, turning to the opposing lawyer. You asked how Ms. Mitchell could afford a brand-name cereal. You asked how she could provide a future for her son. Arthur handed the document to the bailiff. Please give this to the judge, and a copy for Mr. Halloway." The room went deadly silent as the judge took the document. He put on his glasses. He opened the first page. The judge's eyebrows shot up. He adjusted his glasses. He looked at the paper, then at Sarah, then back at the paper. He turned the page. He looked at the signature at the bottom. "Mr. Jenkins," the judge said, his voice trembling slightly. "Is this authenticated?" "Notarized by the High Court of The Hague and the Southern District of New York." "Your Honor," Arthur said. "What is it?" Blake demanded, his voice losing its smooth edge. "What is that?" Arthur turned to Blake, a small, cold smile playing on his lips. "Mr. Anderson, you have been bragging about your $300,000 salary. You have been bullying a woman you thought was a destitute art teacher." Arthur pointed a finger at Sarah, who was now looking up, her eyes clear and dry. "You are looking at Sarah van der Hoven Mitchell. Her grandmother was Eleanor van der Hoven, the matriarch of the Dutch shipping dynasty. When Elena passed away 6 months ago, the trust was unlocked." Halloway snatched the copy of the document from the bailiff. He scanned it frantically. His mouth fell open. This says," Halloway stammered. "It says," Arthur interrupted, "that Ms. Mitchell is the sole beneficiary of the Van der Hoven estate. This includes the shipping lanes, the real estate portfolio in Geneva, and the liquid assets." Arthur leaned in close to Blake. "You mocked her $28,000 salary, but you failed to ask to dividends. As of this morning, the quarterly dividend payment deposited into the trust for Ms. Mitchell was $42 million. The courtroom erupted. Blake stared at Sarah. 40 million quarterly, Arthur corrected. Her total inheritance, conservatively estimated, is valued at $4.2 billion. Sarah finally spoke. She didn't shout. She just leaned into her microphone. "I didn't want Leo to grow up like you, Blake," she said softly. "Obsessed with money, thinking it makes you better than people. So I lived on my salary. I lived small. But you tried to take him away from me because you thought I was poor. You thought you could buy justice." She stood up, and for the first time she looked like the billionaire she was. "You wanted to talk about math. Blake? Let's talk about math. You have a Porsche. I can buy the factory that makes them." Halloway dropped the paper. It fluttered to the floor like a dying bird. But the drama was far from over, because while the money was revealed, the custody battle was still a legal war. And Blake Anderson wasn't the type of man to walk away from $4 billion. He was the type of man to try and steal it. The silence in courtroom 304 was no longer the silence of boredom. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a bomb that had just gone off but hadn't finished destroying the building. Judge Kincaid sat frozen, the blue-bound document resting in his hands like a holy relic. He looked at the figure 4.2 billion. It was a number that made the earlier arguments about grocery bills and rent checks seem like the bickering of children. "Mr. Jenkins," the judge finally said, removing his glasses and rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Just to be absolutely clear, you are telling this court that the defendant, the mother, possesses assets that exceed the GDP of some small nations." "That is correct, Your Honor," Arthur replied, returning to his seat. He moved with a new lightness, the weight of the secret finally off his shoulders. Sarah Mitchell, or rather, Sarah van der Hoven, has merely been living within the means of her salary to maintain a grounded upbringing for her son. There is no law against a wealthy woman living simply. The argument that she is financially unfit is now moot. Sarah looked across the aisle. She expected to see defeat. She expected to see Blake Anderson shrinking into his chair, ashamed of his greed. But she didn't see shame. She saw calculation. Blake was staring at her, his mouth slightly open, his eyes darting back and forth as if he were re-evaluating an investment portfolio. He wasn't looking at his ex-wife. He was looking at a winning lottery ticket he had thrown in the trash. Preston Holloway, however, was faster. The shark had been stunned for exactly 10 seconds. Now the shark was hungry. "Your Honor," Holloway barked, slamming his hand on the table. The sudden noise made the stenographer jump. "I request an immediate recess. This is an ambush. We have been blindsided by critical financial data that was withheld from discovery." "Withheld," Arthur countered calmly. "Mr. Holloway, you asked for an affidavit of her income. The trust is not income. It is an inheritance kept in a separate vehicle until accessed. Sarah has not accessed a penny of it. Therefore, her affidavit was perfectly accurate. She lives on $28,000 a year. It's material information." Holloway screamed, his face turning a shade of plum. "My client has been negotiating custody and support based on the premise that Ms. Mitchell is destitute. This changes the entire landscape of the divorce." Blake leaned over and whispered frantically into Holloway's ear. He grabbed Holloway's forearm, his knuckles white. Holloway listened, his eyes narrowing. He nodded slowly. A slow, terrifying grin spread across the lawyer's face. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "Why are they smiling, Your Honor?" Holloway said, smoothing his tie and lowering his voice to a dangerous, silky tone. "We withdraw our motion for full custody based on financial instability." "Wise," Judge Kincaid grunted. "However," Holloway continued, stepping out from behind his table. He walked toward Sarah, not looking at the judge. "We are now filing an emergency motion regarding the equitable distribution of marital assets." Arthur stood up. "Objection. The divorce decree was agreed upon in principle months ago. We are only here for the custody hearing." "Agreed upon in principle," Holloway said, spinning around to face the room. "But not signed, not finalized, and more importantly based on a fraudulent financial disclosure." Holloway turned to the judge. "Your Honor, Ms. Mitchell's grandmother passed away 6 months ago. Is that correct?" Arthur hesitated. "Yes, approximately." "And 6 months ago," Holloway pressed, "Ms. Mitchell and Mr. Anderson were still legally married. They were living in separate houses, yes, but the divorce was not final. In the state of Illinois, inheritance is generally considered separate property." He paused for effect. "Unless," Holloway shouted, pointing a finger at Blake. "Unless there was a reasonable expectation of shared future assets that influenced the financial decisions of the marriage. Furthermore, if the beneficiary commingled any aspect of that potential inheritance with marital funds, the protection is pierced." "She didn't spend a dime," Arthur argued. "There is no commingling. But there is deception," Holloway roared. "Mr. Anderson paid for the mortgage. Mr. Anderson paid for the car. Mr. Anderson paid the debts. All while his wife was sitting on a secret fortune. That is financial infidelity. Your Honor, it is fraud. And because of that fraud, we argue that the prenuptial agreements are void. We argue that the inheritance received while they were legally husband and wife is subject to division." Blake stood up, looking at Sarah with a look of mock betrayal. "Sarah," he said, his voice trembling with fake emotion. I worked 80-hour weeks. I missed birthdays. I stressed myself into an ulcer to provide for us. And you? You were a billionaire. You watched me struggle and you didn't help. You let me pay for everything while you sat on a mountain of gold. It was a masterclass in gaslighting. Suddenly the man who had mocked her for being poor was playing the victim of her wealth. I didn't tell you, Sarah said, her voice shaking, because I knew this would happen. I knew you'd only love the money, not me. Order. Judge Kincaid banged his gavel. Mr. Halloway, are you suggesting that Mr. Anderson is entitled to a portion of the Vanderhoven estate? Not a portion, Your Honor, Halloway said, buttoning his jacket. Since there was fraud and non-disclosure during the marriage, we are claiming that the assets are communal. We are suing for 50%. The room gasped. 50% of $4 billion. $2 billion. Blake Anderson leaned back in his chair. He looked at Sarah. He mouthed one word. Checkmate. The recess lasted an hour, but to Sarah it felt like a lifetime. She sat in a small consultation room with Arthur. The air conditioner rattled, blowing cold air onto her sweat-dampened skin. Can they do that? Sarah asked, pacing the small room. Arthur, tell me the truth. Can they take half? Arthur sat at the small metal table, polishing his glasses. He looked older than he had in the courtroom. The energy of the reveal had faded, replaced by the grim reality of procedural law. In a perfect world, no, Arthur said heavily. Inheritance is separate property. It belongs to you, not the marriage. That's the law. But, Sarah pressed, I hear a but in your voice. But Halloway is good. He's dirty, but he's good, Arthur admitted. He's going to argue equitable estoppel. He's going to say that by letting Blake pay for everything, while you had access to these funds, you effectively used his money to protect your own capital. He'll argue that you treated the marriage as a business transaction, where you defrauded the partner. Arthur sighed. If the judge buys the argument that your non-disclosure caused Blake financial harm, that he wouldn't have worked so hard or spent so much if he had known the judge could order a settlement. Maybe not 50%. But even 10% is $400 million. And worse. Worse, if the assets are frozen pending litigation, Arthur said, looking her in the eye. Halloway will petition for Blake to have temporary custody of Leo. He'll argue that you are currently under investigation for financial fraud and perjury. Sarah slammed her hand against the wall. He doesn't want Leo. He wants the leverage. He'll trade Leo for a payout. Exactly, Arthur said. That is his play. The door opened. The bailiff poked his head in. Judge is ready. Walking back into the courtroom felt different. Before, Sarah was the underdog. Now she was the target. The atmosphere had shifted from pity to envy. Everyone looked at her, the bailiff, the clerk, the random people in the gallery. They weren't seeing a mother anymore. They were seeing walking money. Judge Kincaid looked stern. He had clearly spent the recess reading case law. Please be seated, the judge said. I have reviewed the emergency motion filed by Mr. Halloway. Halloway stood looking confident. He had spent the recess giving an interview on the courthouse steps, spinning the story of the poor, deceived husband. Mr. Jenkins, the judge addressed Arthur, the timeline is problematic for your client. The date of death for Eleanor Vanderhoven was November the 12th. The initial filing for divorce was November the 14th. 2 days later. A coincidence, Your Honor, Arthur said. Ms. Mitchell was grieving. She wasn't thinking about filing papers. Or, Halloway interjected. She waited until the trust was secure, then filed for divorce, hoping to hide the asset before the discovery phase. It looks like premeditated shielding of marital assets. Ms. Mitchell, the judge asked Sarah directly, did you use any marital funds to facilitate the transfer of this inheritance? Did you use the family car to drive to the lawyer? Did you use the family phone plan to call the executors? Sarah froze. I drove my car, which is in Blake's name because his credit was better. I used my phone on the family plan. Holloway threw his hands up. There it is. Marital resources used to secure the asset that opens the door. Your Honor. It was a ridiculous technicality. Using a phone plan to call a lawyer shouldn't cost a woman $2 billion. But in high-stakes divorce court, ridiculous technicalities were weapons of mass destruction. Your Honor. Blake spoke up, his voice somber. I don't want to hurt Sarah. I really don't. But I feel used. I feel like my entire marriage was a lie. If she could hide $4 billion, what else was she hiding? Was she faithful? Was she? Objection! Arthur roared, banging his cane on the floor. Character assassination. Sustained, the judge said, but the damage was done. The seed of doubt was planted. I am inclined, Judge Kincaid said slowly, to grant a temporary freeze on the assets of the Vander Hoven Trust, pending a forensic audit of the marriage finances. Holloway pumped his fist. Blake smirked. And, the judge continued, regarding custody. Sarah stopped breathing. Given the complex nature of the impending litigation and the volatility this will introduce into Ms. Mitchell's life, I am concerned about the stability of the home environment. Your Honor, Holloway said quickly. Mr. Anderson is ready to take Leo immediately. His home is stable. No press. No auditors knocking on the door. No, Sarah screamed. She couldn't help it. You can't take him. He's my son. Ms. Mitchell, sit down, the bailiff warned, moving toward her. I am ruling, Judge Kincaid said, raising his gavel. The temporary primary custody is awarded to Mr. Anderson effective immediately. Ms. Mitchell will have weekend visitation rights. Bang! The gavel sounded like a gunshot. Sarah felt her knees give way. She collapsed into her chair, gasping for air. They had done it. They had turned her victory into a nightmare. They had taken her money, frozen it so she couldn't use it to fight them, and taken her son. Blake stood up and walked over to Sarah's table. He leaned down close to her ear. You should have just told me, Sarah. He whispered, his voice cold and dead. We could have been a power couple. Now I'm going to take half your money, and I'm going to raise our son to hate you. I'm going to buy him everything you couldn't, and by the time he's 10, he won't even remember your name. He straightened up, buttoned his suit jacket, and walked out of the courtroom like a king. Arthur Jenkins sat motionless. He stared at the closed doors. Arthur, Sarah sobbed, grabbing his sleeve. Do something, you said. You said the inheritance was safe. Arthur turned to her. His eyes were no longer kind. They were furious. But not at her. I said the inheritance was safe, Sarah. And it is. Arthur opened his briefcase again. He pulled out a second document. It was smaller, handwritten on yellow legal paper. Holloway made a mistake, Arthur murmured. A classic, arrogant mistake. He assumed the Vander Hoven Trust was the only card we had. What? Sarah wiped her eyes. What do you mean? He argued that because the grandmother died on November the 12th, the money is marital property. Arthur said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. But he forgot to ask one very specific question. He forgot to ask which grandmother. Sarah stared at him. I only have one grandmother. Elena. No. Arthur smiled, and it was a terrifying smile. You had a step-grandmother, Eleanor's partner, a woman named Martha, and Martha didn't die 6 months ago. Arthur tapped the yellow paper. She died 30 years ago, and she left a dormant account, an account that predates your marriage, predates your birth, an account that Halloway doesn't know exists because it's not in the trust. It's in a private holding in the Cayman Islands. Arthur stood up. Let him take Leo for tonight. Let him think he's won. Because tomorrow morning we aren't going to fight him in family court. Where are we going? Sarah asked. We are going to federal court, Arthur said. Because what Blake Anderson did with Nexus Global during that merger, the one I asked him about. That wasn't just a bonus he received. Arthur looked at the door where Blake had exited. I have proof that Blake committed insider trading to buy that Porsche. And tomorrow, we aren't suing for custody. We are sending the FBI to his front door. The champagne in Blake Anderson's glass cost $300 a bottle. It tasted like victory. It was 9:00 p.m., 6 hours after the gavel had fallen in Judge Kincaid's courtroom. Blake was pacing the marble floors of his living room in the exclusive Highland Estates gated community. Outside, the autumn wind whipped against the floor-to-ceiling windows, but inside the fire was roaring and the mood was electric. Preston Halloway sat on the Italian leather sofa loosening his tie. He looked exhausted, but smug. You have to admit, Blake. Halloway chuckled, swirling his drink. The financial infidelity angle was genius. I saw the blood drain out of Jenkins' face. The old man didn't know what hit him. He's a dinosaur, Blake scoffed, admiring his reflection in the darkened window. And Shra, she's just a deer in headlights. She honestly thought she could walk in there, wave a piece of paper, and I'd just roll over. She forgot who I am. Well, Halloway cautioned, don't get too comfortable. We still have to win the forensic audit. If she really has $4 billion, she can hire an army of lawyers eventually. We need to force a settlement fast. Threaten to drag the custody battle out for years. She'll pay half just to get the kid back. Speaking of the kid, Blake muttered, glancing toward the hallway. Is he asleep? The nanny put him down an hour ago, Halloway said. He was crying for his mom. Kind of a buzzkill. He'll get over it, Blake said, waving his hand dismissively. Once I buy him that pony or whatever it is kids like, he'll forget all about Sarah and her watercolor paints. Blake walked to the wet bar to refill his glass. He felt invincible. He had the sun, he had the house, and soon he would have a payout that would put him in the history books. To the Van der Hoeven fortune, Blake toasted, raising his glass high. To 50%. Halloway grinned, clinking his glass against Blake's. Crash. The sound didn't come from the glasses. It came from the front door. It wasn't a knock. It was the sound of a heavy battering ram, splintering solid oak. Before Blake could even process the noise, the foyer exploded with movement. Flashlights cut through the dim mood lighting of the living room, blindingly bright. Heavy boots thundered on the marble. Federal agents, hands in the air. Nobody move. Blake dropped his glass. It shattered, spraying $300 champagne onto his shoes. What the hell? Blake screamed, shielding his eyes. This is private property. Halloway, do something. Halloway had already done something. He had thrown himself onto the floor, hands laced behind his head, instinct taking over. He knew exactly what this was. A dozen figures in tactical gear swarmed the room. The letters FBI were emblazoned in yellow on their armored vests. "Blake Anderson," a voice boomed. A man in a windbreaker stepped through the tactical team. He was holding a warrant. "I am Special Agent Miller, FBI Financial Crimes Division. You are under arrest." "Arrest?" Blake stammered, his voice jumping an octave. "For what I won custody." "This is a mistake. My ex-wife sent you, didn't she?" "She's crazy." Agent Miller didn't smile. He walked up to Blake, grabbed his wrist and spun him around. The handcuffs clicked, cold, tight, and final. "We aren't here for a domestic dispute, Mr. Anderson. We are here regarding the global maritime logistics merger." Blake froze. The air left his lungs. "You are being charged with 3 counts of securities fraud, 2 counts of insider trading, and 1 count of wire fraud." Miller reciting the rights as he marched Blake towards the door. "Holloway!" Blake screamed, looking back at his lawyer. "Represent me. Fix this." Holloway was still on the floor. He looked up, his face pale. He saw the specific agents securing Blake's laptop and phone. He saw the seriousness of the charge. I practice family law." "Blake," Holloway stammered, distancing himself instantly. "I don't do federal criminal defense." "You coward!" Blake shrieked as he was dragged out into the cool night air. The perfectly manicured lawn of Highland Estates was lit up by red and blue strobes. Neighbors were coming out onto their porches in their bathrobes, watching the VP of sales being stuffed into the back of a black SUV. But the most devastating moment for Blake wasn't the handcuffs. It wasn't the neighbors watching. It was seeing who was standing at the edge of his driveway next to a silver sedan. It was Arthur Jenkins. The old man was leaning on his cane, watching the scene with a grim, satisfied expression. Beside him stood a woman from Child Protective Services. As the agents secured the house, the CPS worker went inside. Minutes later, she emerged carrying a sleepy, confused Leo, wrapped in a blanket. "Daddy." Leo rubbed his eyes, looking at the police lights. "It's okay, Leo," Arthur said, stepping forward. His voice was gentle, a stark contrast to the chaos. "Your dad has to go away for a while, but your mum is waiting for you." Blake slammed his face against the window of the SUV, screaming, but the soundproof glass swallowed his rage. He watched as Arthur Jenkins opened the car door for Leo, safe and calm. The predator had become the prey, and the hunter was a man with a cane and a dormant account from 1995. The interrogation room inside the federal building in downtown Chicago was designed to strip a man of his soul layer by layer. It was a cold, windowless box painted a shade of beige that felt like it had been harvested from a nightmare. The air was recycled and stale, smelling faintly of floor wax and old coffee that had been burned on the pot hours ago. Blake Anderson sat at the metal table, his hands clasping and unclasping in a rhythm of pure anxiety. They had taken his belt. They had taken his shoelaces. They had taken his phone, his wallet, and the platinum Rolex Submariner that he used to define his self-worth. Without the props of his success, Blake looked smaller. He looked like exactly what he was, a man whose luck had finally run dry. He had been sitting there for 3 hours. Every time the ventilation system rattled, his head snapped up, expecting the door to open. He rehearsed his speech in his mind. He would threaten to sue. He would demand to speak to the director. He would charm his way out of this, just like he had charmed his way into boardrooms and country clubs. "It's just a misunderstanding," he told himself, sweat prickling his hairline. "Holloway will fix this. Holloway always fixes this." The heavy steel door buzzed. The sound was electric and harsh, vibrating through the table. Blake straightened his spine, trying to summon the ghost of his corporate arrogance. "It's about time," he muttered, preparing to unleash a tirade. The door swung open. Special Agent Miller walked in first. He was a man made of sharp angles and silence, holding a thick manila file under his arm. But it wasn't Miller who made Blake's blood turn to ice. It was the man following him, Arthur Jenkins. The old lawyer walked in with the slow, deliberate pace of a funeral procession. He didn't look like a man who had been up all night. He looked fresh, alert, and terrifyingly calm. He leaned his cane against the wall and stood in the shadows, his eyes fixed on Blake. "What is he doing here?" Blake demanded, his voice cracking on the first syllable. He pointed a shaking finger at Arthur. "That's my wife's divorce lawyer. This is a conflict of interest. I want my attorney. Where is Preston Halloway?" Agent Miller didn't answer immediately. He pulled out a metal chair, the legs screeching against the linoleum floor, and sat down opposite Blake. He placed the file on the table, aligning the edges with geometric precision. "Your attorney isn't coming, Mr. Anderson," Miller said. His voice was flat, devoid of sympathy. "What do you mean he's not coming?" "I pay him $600 an hour. Mr. Halloway has formally recused himself from your defense," Miller explained, opening the file. "In fact, as we speak, Mr. Halloway is in an interview room down the hall with the Bar Association and the U.S. Attorney's Office. He is currently negotiating a plea deal to retain his license to practice law." Blake blinked, his mouth falling open. He's talking. "He is singing," Miller corrected. He was quite eager to explain that he had no knowledge of your insider trading activities. He claims he was merely a pawn in your deception. He's throwing you to the wolves, Blake, to save his own skin. The realization hit Blake like a physical blow. The alliance was dead. The shark had eaten the other shark. "I didn't do anything," Blake stammered, leaning back as if trying to put distance between himself and the file. "I'm a VP of sales. I don't look at trade logs. This is a witch hunt because my ex-wife is bitter." "Sit down," Miller ordered. "It wasn't a request." Blake slumped back into the chair. "Let's talk about Nexus Global and the Global Maritime Logistics merger," Miller said. He pulled a single sheet of paper from the file and slid it across the table. It was a printout of a digital trade log. The numbers were highlighted in neon yellow. "On May 14th at 10:42 a.m., your personal trading account executed a purchase order for 10,000 call options on Global Maritime Logistics," Miller recited. "At that specific moment, the stock was trading flat. There was no news, no rumors, just a quiet Tuesday morning." Miller tapped the paper. 3 minutes later at 10:45 a.m., the merger was announced on the wire. The stock jumped 40% in 10 minutes. You cashed out by lunch. You netted a profit of exactly $312,000. "I got lucky," Blake said, sweat now running openly down his temples. "I follow the market. I had a gut feeling. Is it a crime to have good instincts?" "A gut feeling." Miller repeated, his tone dry. "That's what you're going with?" "Yes, it was a hunch." "Interesting," Miller said. He reached into the file again. "Because we pulled your phone records. You deleted the texts, of course. But you forget that nothing is ever really deleted when the feds are involved." He slid a second piece of paper across the table. It was a transcript of a text message conversation. "At 10:40 a.m., 2 minutes before you bought the stock, you received a message from a number registered to a Greg Salter. Greg was your fraternity brother, wasn't he? He currently works as a junior analyst at the regulatory firm that approved the merger." Miller leaned in, reading the text aloud. Green light is on. Ink is dry. Buy now, buy heavy. Dinner is on you. The silence in the room was deafening. The hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to drill into Blake's skull. We have Greg in the next room, Miller whispered. Greg is very scared, and scared people are very talkative. He's already admitted to tipping you off. Blake put his head in his hands. The room was spinning. The Porsche, the gated community, the tailored suits, it was all dissolving into smoke. Insider trading carries a maximum sentence of 20 years per count, Blake, Miller said, leaning back. Plus fines, plus restitution. And since you used the proceeds of a federal crime to secure a mortgage across state lines, we've tacked on wire fraud. You are looking at a very, very long time in a very small cell. Blake looked up. His eyes rimmed with red. It was just a bonus. Everyone does it. Why are you destroying my life over one trade? Not everyone mocks the mother of their child for being poor while committing felonies to pretend they are rich. A voice spoke from the corner. Blake snapped his head toward the shadows. Arthur Jenkins stepped into the light. You set me up. Blake hissed, his fear momentarily replaced by venom. That day in court, when you asked me about the merger, you weren't establishing my finances. You were laying a trap. I asked you if you were the lead on the integration. Arthur corrected his voice, calm and melodic. I needed you to confirm under oath on the public record that you had intimate knowledge of the company's timeline. You swore you did. You tied yourself to the crime scene, Mr. Anderson. I didn't dig your grave. I just handed you the shovel. Blake stared at the old man. He realized now that Arthur Jenkins wasn't just a dusty estate lawyer. He was a grand master who had been playing 5 moves ahead while Blake was still reading the instructions. Agent Miller cleared his throat. Here is the situation, Blake. The federal case is airtight. You are going to prison. The only question is for how long. And more importantly, where? Miller gestured to Arthur. Mr. Jenkins here has a proposition regarding the pending state charges. State charges, Blake whispered. What state charges? Arthur stepped forward, placing his hands on the back of the empty chair next to Miller. Perjury, Arthur listed, counting on his fingers. Fraud upon the court, falsifying financial affidavits, and attempted extortion of a minor for financial gain. I have the paperwork drafted. I can file these charges with the Cook County District Attorney tomorrow morning. Arthur leaned in close. If I file those charges, Blake, you won't go to federal prison. Not yet. You will sit in the Cook County Jail holding a waiting trial for the next 3 years. Then you will serve state time. And only then will you be transferred to federal custody. You'll be 70 years old before you see a golf course again. Blake felt like he couldn't breathe. What do you want? Arthur reached into the inside pocket of his tweed jacket. He pulled out a single document. It wasn't bound in blue cardstock. It was simple white paper. I want you to sign this. Blake looked at the bold heading at the top of the page, Voluntary Relinquishment of Parental Rights. You want me to give up Leo? Blake choked out. He's my son. Is he? Arthur asked, his voice suddenly hard as iron. Or is he just another asset? Something to be leveraged? You were willing to trade his happiness for a payout. Blake, you were willing to take him from a loving mother just to hurt her. I can't just sign him away. If you sign, Arthur continued, ignoring the plea, Sarah will decline to press the state charges. You will deal only with Agent Miller here. You cooperate with the feds. You give up Holloway. You plead guilty. Maybe with good behavior you're out in 8 years. You can restart your life. Alone. Arthur slid a pen across the table. It clicked against the metal surface. But Leo is done with you. He deserves a parent who doesn't view him as a bargaining chip. Blake looked at the pen. Then he looked at his reflection in the one-way mirror. He saw a man who had lost everything. He thought about the county jail, the violence, the noise, the decades of lost time. He thought about the $4 billion he had almost touched. He realized with a sickening jolt that he never really cared about the boy. He cared about winning, and he had lost. Does she hate me? Blake asked, his voice barely a whisper. He looked up at Arthur, looking for absolution. Arthur didn't give him any. She doesn't think about you at all, Blake, Arthur said coldly. She's busy being a mother. Blake picked up the pen. His hand shook violently. He pressed the tip to the paper. Scritch. Scratch. He signed his name. It was a messy, defeated scrawl. Arthur snatched the paper away the second the pen lifted. He checked the signature, nodded once to Agent Miller, and turned his back on Blake Anderson forever. The lobby. 30 minutes later, Arthur Jenkins walked out of the elevators and into the expansive lobby of the Federal Building. The morning sun was just beginning to stream through the high glass windows, cutting through the dust motes dancing in the air. Sarah Mitchell, Sarah van der Hoven, was sitting on a wooden bench near the security checkpoint. She wasn't wearing designer clothes. She was still in her navy blazer, looking tired with dark circles under her eyes. But she held herself differently now. The hunch of poverty was gone. Curled up in her lap, wrapped in a blanket provided by CPS, was Leo. He was fast asleep, his thumb near his mouth clutching the lapel of his mother's jacket as if it were a lifeline. Arthur walked over slowly. The click of his cane on the terrazzo floor made Sarah look up. Her eyes were wide, filled with a mixture of hope and terror. Arthur sat down next to her. He didn't speak for a long moment. He just let the peace of the morning settle over them. "Is it done?" Sarah whispered, afraid to wake the boy. Arthur reached into his pocket and tapped the folded paper. "It's done." He signed. Sole legal and physical custody. No visitation. He has no claim on you and no claim on Leo. Ever again. Sarah closed her eyes. Her shoulders shook, and a single tear tracked through the smudge of makeup on her cheek. She exhaled a breath she felt she had been holding for 6 years. "He's going to prison?" she asked softly. "For the insider trading, yes," Arthur said. "For a significant amount of time." Sarah looked down at her son, brushing a stray lock of hair from his forehead. "I didn't want this, Arthur. I didn't want to destroy him. I just wanted him to leave us alone." "You didn't destroy him, Sarah," Arthur said gently. "Greed is a heavy weight. Some people try to carry too much of it, and they drown. You tried to throw him a lifeline. He chose to swim deeper." "What do we do now?" Sarah asked, looking out at the busy street. "The press. They're going to find out about the money. Holloway knows. Blake knows. It's going to be a circus." Arthur chuckled, a warm, raspy sound. "Mr. Holloway is currently trying to avoid federal indictment himself. He won't be leaking anything to the press. And as for the money, the trust has resources. We can move you. Tonight. Somewhere quiet. Switzerland. The Hamptons. Somewhere you can disappear." Sarah adjusted Leo in her arms. She felt the warmth of his small body, the steady rhythm of his breathing. She looked at the city outside the city, where she had struggled, where she had counted coupons, where she had fought for every inch of her life. "I don't want to run Arthur," she said, her voice finding a new strength. "I haven't done anything wrong. This is my money. This is my son. And this is my life." She stood up, lifting Leo effortlessly. She looked like a billionaire. She looked like a warrior. "I think I'm going to stay right here," Sarah said, a small smile touching her lips. "I drove past the old community center last week. They're closing it down due to lack of funding." She looked at Arthur. "I think I'll buy it. I'll turn it into a real art school. For kids who can't afford lessons. For kids like Leo." Arthur smiled, pushing himself up on his cane. He tipped his invisible hat to her. "A fine investment, Ms. van der Hoven," he said. "A very fine investment indeed." Sarah Mitchell walked into that courtroom, a victim mocked for the few dollars in her pocket. She walked out a billionaire, not because of the money in her bank account, but because she knew the true value of things. Blake Anderson thought wealth was a weapon to hurt people, and in the end, it was the weapon that destroyed him. It's a powerful reminder. Never judge someone by their shoes, because you never know where they've walked or what they're carrying in their briefcase. If you enjoyed this story of justice served cold, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Turn on notifications so you never miss a story. And let us know in the comments, what would you do if you found out your ex was secretly a billionaire? See you in the next video.